Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we have a very special guest today. We'd like to welcome to the podcast Kentucky author Stuart Sanders, who's wrote many books, two about the Battle of Perryville, one about the Battle of Mill Springs, and his most recent book, Murder on the Ohio Belle. Stuart, how you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, in my opinion, you're kind of a pretty big Kentucky author, especially Civil War. I mean, it's a good hot topic issue that everybody's always ready to talk about some Civil War. And in my mind, you're the expert on Perryville for sure.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I was lucky enough to work there for about 10 years, and I was involved with historic preservation efforts and also interpreting the battlefield. So it's definitely a place near and dear to my heart, that's for sure. And, of course, a place that has incredible stories to tell too, which is the most important part of it. So I think it's a great sort of living learning laboratory in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I agree, and that's kind of the point of the podcast, is telling kind of these Kentucky stories that are all out there. There's so many to talk about.
Right.
But before we get into too much, I guess tell us about your Kentucky connection and so
Sure.
forth.
Yeah, well, I actually grew up in Lexington, Virginia, which is a town that's just immersed in Civil War history. It's the burial site of both Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And I grew up 2 doors down from the house where Stonewall Jackson lay in state after his body was sent back to Lexington, Virginia. And in high school, I ended up working at the Lee Chapel, which is where Robert E. Lee's buried. So I've always been sort of immersed in Civil War history. Yeah, and growing up there, I actually sort of fought against becoming a Civil War enthusiast in a lot of ways, because I was just surrounded by it. But then I ended up coming out to Kentucky for college. I went to Center College in Danville and basically never left. I've got a lot of Kentucky connections, though. I've had family here since the 1770s, and my parents actually met at Center, and they're both, and my mom's from Louisville too. So a lot of great Kentucky connections, and that's really gotten me interested in not only the state Civil War history, but the history in general. And so it's been kind of fun to come back here and kind of reestablish the family roots in a sense, and learn more not only about my own family history, but also the history of the Great Commonwealth. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, I talk a lot with people about Danville,
Yeah,
Harrodsburg, Stanford, and that's kind of a big center of Kentucky history. I mean, all right there.
yeah, it's
A lot of
everywhere.
stuff going on.
Yeah, and that's what's so wonderful about Kentucky. I mean, so much of the history has been preserved, and just driving down downtown Danville, for example, you go by Constitution Square, which was the site of a major field hospital after the Battle of Perryville. Not to mention where the Constitutional Conventions were held there. The Ephraim McDowell House is across the street, and you continue down to the courthouse where all this history's happened to, and then on to the Perryville battlefield. So I mean, in one sort of 9 to 10 mile area, you've got so much incredibly rich history. So it's just it's always exciting to kind of take road trips around the state and learn more about the past.
Yeah, I totally agree with there. It would be great to have like all the. Well, I mean, there's so many different little elements, I guess, that you think about in the Civil War in every county as well.
Right.
Like we had Barry Duvall on. He talked about Muhlenberg County during the Civil War, and it's different in every county just about it.
Right. Yeah, and every county was touched by the war, of course, too, and from the guerrilla war, later on to major battles as well. And so there's if you have an interest in the Civil War, there's something for everybody to learn more about. Whether it's the enlistment of Black Union troops at Camp Nelson, to struggles over emancipation, to that guerrilla war, to cavalry raids and skirmishes. Yeah, Sue Mundy, and it's never ending. And the fact you can tour all these communities and get a different story. Whether you're going to Shaker Village at Pleasant Hill that has a handful of Confederate troops buried there who were there as part of the Perryville campaign, to larger cities like Louisville that have an incredibly rich story on their own. So we're really lucky to have again wonderfully preserved battlefields and historic sites around the state that sort of help us tell these stories.
Yeah,
and podcasts too.
Yeah, that's right.
Like yours. Seriously, I mean, it's great that you're doing this, and as I was telling you earlier, I'm a subscriber and was listening to a few of the episodes earlier today, and appreciate you, working to preserve and promote history in your own right. So thanks for doing that.
Thank you, thank you for listening as well.
Yeah.
um, yeah, well, I got to throw out, Crab Orchard even has a historical marker, and some Confederate soldiers. That the Crab Orchard Baptist was used as a hospital for a while too. All that sort of stuff filtering off of Perryville
Right.
during that time. So when the big question I always get, or always kind of thinking, is how, or I guess maybe not that I'm thinking, but whenever you're talking about the Civil War, everybody always, they still to this day, 170 years later or so, however much it may be, still kind of get that, they have their connections,
Right.
and people are, go back and forth, but how do you approach, I guess, covering or talking about the Civil War? In my own self, I'm not going to get upset about what anybody says, or what anybody may think,
Right.
but people can get a little, I guess, defensive on their Civil War talk. Well,
Yeah.
how do you approach that?
People love it. There's a great example. The former Perryville park manager told me a story once that a man came in talking about, he was trying to find more information about his Civil War ancestor. And he said, he fought for the Confederacy in the Kentucky Regiment. He was really excited to learn more. And then he said, he served in the 20th Kentucky. And of course, there wasn't a 20th Kentucky Confederate infantry. And so it turned out his ancestor was a Union soldier. And he was horrified by that and actually left. And, sort of, in a sense, strangely turned his back on this ancestor. And for me, you also, when researching the Civil War, you just have to sort of go where the sources are leading you. That's why, primary sources are so important. And, as a teacher, this, and probably tell your students all the time, we're so lucky to have great archives around the state, and, have the official records of the war, and have archives around the country, actually, that touch on, different Kentucky topics. So what I've always found is, if you're going to that source material and backing it up with additional sources, then I think you're telling a pretty solid story. The thing is, people get so emotional about that conflict that I think sometimes that tends to sort of blind them from taking the time to really be open-minded about what they're learning and what they're trying to find out about. And I get that, and I think that's why going to battlefields is so important too, because you're literally sort of walking in the footsteps of history, and it gives you a much deeper understanding of what the conflict was like. And again, I encourage people to sort of, at some point, do archival work, whether you're researching a Civil War ancestor or research a battle in your own right, because it's going to open up your eyes about the war in pretty miraculous ways. So again, I just try to let the source material lead me to where the conclusions go.
Yeah. So Perryville, I guess, where do you even get started when you're talking about Perryville? Because a lot of research is out there. A lot
Right.
of I had people tell me they've documented almost anything you can think about in Perryville is almost documented down to a T. So where do you begin? I guess when if we're going to talk about Perryville. A big battle, especially
Right.
I would say the biggest one in Kentucky,
Right.
or probably the most important as well.
Right.
Is that?
I think so. I think Mill Springs is also equally important, and we can get into that a little bit later too. For me, starting with Perryville, I tend to start with John Hunt Morgan, the Kentucky cavalryman who was from Lexington, and he had raided the state in the summer of 1862 and had been sort of favorably greeted by residents. And Morgan became quickly convinced that if Kentucky were held, that tens of thousands of Kentuckians would sort of rally to the Confederate cause, would join the armies. And he sort of, a few historians have kind of called this a Kentucky fever that he started among members of the Confederate High Command. It got sort of Confederate generals excited about the potential that Kentucky might hold if they could come into the Commonwealth and hold it. And around that same time, multiple Confederate armies were trying to figure out a way to shove Union troops out of Middle Tennessee. And in order to do that, they also realized they needed to save or protect Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is a vital railroad junction. And sort of to make a long story short, as as Union Army started pressing toward Chattanooga, one Confederate Army commanded by General Edmund Kirby Smith, kind of not following the agreement he'd had with another Confederate general, sort of launching an invasion of Kentucky, ended up fighting a battle at Richmond, Kentucky, and that forced sort of General Braxton Bragg's Army of the Mississippi to come into the state. Eventually, the Confederates sort of spread out around the state, and Union troops who'd made their way to Louisville ended up getting tens of thousands of new recruits into their army, and then sort of started pressing down toward the Bardstown area to shove part of the Confederates out of the Commonwealth. And as they did that, they ended up withdrawing to Springfield, and then withdrew to Perryville and sort of halted there. The Union Army had a diversion toward Frankfort, and that sort of fooled General Bragg, the Confederate commander, into thinking that his troops only faced a small force at Perryville. However, the reason they stopped there, though, there's sort of people always say falsely how Gettysburg was fought because troops were looking for shoes. And it's sort of the same thing about Perryville. There's the story that, the soldiers were fighting over water, which wasn't really the case. What had actually happened is the Confederates, during their kind of occupation of Kentucky, had literally stored, just piles and piles and piles of provisions and supplies at the site of Camp Dick Robinson in Garrett County. And so the Confederate Army is essentially trying to stay between the Union Army pushing eastward from Bardstown and those supplies at Camp Dick Robinson. And so, the Confederates, again, thinking they were facing a much more minor force, ended up attacking, not realizing that, thousands of Union troops were sort of just a few miles from the battlefield ready to enter the fray. But the battle lasted, about 5 hours. More than 7,500 men were killed and wounded. And it proved to be Kentucky's largest battle. Yeah. And it was a turning point of the war. The Confederates won a tactical victory, but encountered a strategic defeat because there were so many Union troops, again, who were ready to reinforce the Union Army, that the Confederates realized that they needed to leave the area, and they ultimately left Kentucky. And never again did Confederate troops try to hold the Commonwealth for the Confederacy. So, it really kept Kentucky in Union hands for the remainder of the war.
Well, that's a pretty good summary.
Hopefully.
You've said that a few times before.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Man, the number, you said 7,500 in 5 hours.
Yeah, were killed and wounded. And so I wrote a book on the aftermath of the battle called Perryville Under Fire. And in that book, I actually, it's a lot of the soldiers who fought really commented on how it was the most severe battle that they were in terms of, it's kind of never-ending fighting for that 5 hour time. Because, if you've been to Perryville, you know that there's sort of these hilltops that are closely packed together. So as the Union Army got sort of driven back, they would establish defensive positions on one successive hilltop after another. So, they'd get shoved back 100 yards to another hill, would make an obstinate defense, would get shoved back to another hill 50 yards away, would make another defense. And this sort of went on and on and on. It was just sort of this grinding attack that happened. And, it's really points to the importance of terrain during the battle too. And that's sort of another thing that I think a lot of historians have really done a good job sort of paying attention to and interpreting.
Yeah. Now, I think I remember the sounds, the cannon sounds, and how people were able. It was just so loud that people could hear it for so far away.
Right. And there's sort of an interesting irony to that too, because there were, I sort of think of Perryville as you had roughly, 16,000 Confederates attacking, let's just say 18,000 Union troops north of town. But there were roughly 20,000 Union troops west of Perryville and 20,000 more south of Perryville that were never really engaged in the fighting. So you have, this massive Union Army present and, sort of smaller numbers actually engaged in the fight. And even though the cannons were so loud that window panes rattled 10 miles away in Danville and the Shakers of Pleasant Hill could hear the cannons booming, there's a strange atmospheric phenomenon at Perryville called an acoustic shadow, where most of the Union troops, even though they were just a few miles away from this scene of horrific fighting, they never really heard most of the battle taking place. And General Buell, who was the Union commander, was actually been thrown from his horse. He was sort of sitting in a kind of near a house that was in a ravine, and he only heard a few scattered shots. And even though he didn't realize that this massive, the battle for Kentucky was going on, He basically turned to some of his staff members and said, "You go tell those men to quit wasting that gunpowder." And so, Buell had no idea that this massive fight was going on until it was almost too late. And so Union reinforcements weren't sent in until late in the day. And a lot of those regiments were actually decimated, including the 22nd Indiana Infantry Regiment that lost about 70% of their command. So you had, 7 out of 10 men were killed and wounded in a very short amount of time as the battle sort of drew to a close.
Wow. Well, and I mean, 16,000, that just sounds like so many soldiers in this battle.
Yeah, well, that's only the Confederate Army. So you have, 16,000 Confederate troops and roughly 80,000 Union troops. And so think what, just that number of men and, the needs that they had in terms of water, in terms of, food and shelter, not to mention the horses that needed, food and water as well. And, communities were literally picked clean. Farms were, like food that farmers owned was just swept away like locusts, essentially.
Yeah.
And the campaign was also made more difficult too, because there was a terrible drought in Kentucky. It hadn't rained for weeks. Most creeks and streams were dry. And there's a story of a Union soldier who was marching from Springfield toward Perryville. He was filling up his canteen, and he looked at one end of the water, and his comrades were washing their feet in socks. And then he looks at the other end of the water, and there's a dead mule floating in it. And so, they had to drink out of these terrible conditions. And of course, that led to, literally thousands of cases of illness of men who suffer from dysentery and typhoid and, other terrible diseases. And, it ended up killing hundreds and hundreds of men who died of disease from drinking that terrible water. Then the drought also compounded suffering after the battle too, because one Union doctor commented that he couldn't find enough water to wash the blood from his hands for 2 days. So he's going from, his hands are caked with blood from doing operations, and he's just running from, one patient to another, spreading disease. And that's why mortality rates were, exceptionally high after the battle.
Yeah. Wow. That is well, amazing, I guess, to think that, or crazy how those, factors kind of, played out. I mean,
right.
With that many troops though, I mean, it's understandable. I think of like a comparison. I've been reading. We've talked about on the podcast the War of 1812, and those armies or those armies, I guess to say, or those battalions or those battles are fought between 3,000 people or something, right. and not that many. And now this is almost quadruple that amount, if not more. 50 years later,
right.
It really, a big comparison there. I mean, that's a big difference, I guess, when you think about that.
Right. It's incredible, really. And, the other thing, too, so many of the troops that were present at Perryville, at least on the Union side, were actually raw recruits. They'd the 21st Wisconsin Infantry, for example, that got mauled on the northern end of the battlefield. They were stuck in a cornfield sort of between two hills and just got torn apart. They lost probably, 50, 60% of their command. And a lot of those men, they'd been in the Army for less than a month. It was said that, some of those troops had never, ever fired their rifles before. So, you have these green Union soldiers who are thrown into this, horrific battle and just got torn apart. So, it was sort of a shocking baptism of fire for a lot of the Union soldiers, facing sort of more battle-hardened Confederates.
Yeah. So what, you said there was other Union troops. What prevented them from getting involved?
Well, it was part of it was that acoustic shadow. They were just sort of never ordered into the fight until it was too late, as part of the reason. So I think, probably more people heard the fighting than, sort of that the story of the acoustic shadow. I think it did happen, but it's also, I'm sure other troops heard, the cannons booming and the rifles firing just a few miles away. But they just weren't sent in. I think one thing that had happened is the Union Army sort of stormed down from Louisville. The Confederates retreated from Bardstown. They retreated again at Springfield, and then when they got to Perryville, the Union Army sort of started forming on ridges around town, and the Confederate Army ended up were initially in the town of Perryville. And to attack, they knew that there was activity north of town, that Union troops were up in that area. So they marched their army from downtown Perryville, sort of following the Chaplin River northward. And as they did so, because of the drought, they kicked up these immense clouds of dust. And it could be the Union troops who were on what is now the present day battlefield could see these immense clouds of dust just sort of rising over the town of Perryville. So they think, oh, the Confederates have retreated from Bardstown, they retreated from Springfield. Looks like they're now retreating to Harrodsburg. And so they were completely fooled by this, thinking that these clouds of dust marked a Confederate withdrawal again. But that wasn't what was happening. So when the Confederates actually stormed north of Perryville and attacked what was the Union First Corps, a lot of those Union troops were completely caught by surprise. They thought the Confederates had left the area. So I think that's another reason Union troops were not sent in. I think they were just sort of unprepared because they were fooled by this, just sort of this coincidence that they happened to kick up a lot of dust. And you think if it were raining, or drizzling, that it kept the dust down, could that have changed the outcome of the battle? Would the Union Army have been better prepared? And more, a little more wary of what the Confederate Army was doing. But there was a lack of cavalry reconnaissance too, and a lot of things went wrong for the Union Army. And again, having green troops as a bulk of the army didn't really help either.
Well, I'm going to ask I'm going to ask two questions.
Sure.
The first one, answer second, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
How battle trained were the Confederates would be the one question, but the other one, it's almost, well, I guess this isn't a question, it's a comment, but like it's almost that the Confederates, use that war tactic of make yourself, make your army seem bigger than what it is,
right,
on accident in a way.
Yeah, it was completely accidental because again Bragg, the Confederate commander, thought he was only facing a small force at Perryville. So it's sort of like, look, we'll sort of punch him in the nose, then we'll go on our way up toward Versailles to join up with Edmund Kirby Smith's army, because he thought that Buell's army was actually moving from Louisville toward Frankfort because of this division that had been sent as a diversion. And so he thought, we'll smack the Union Army in the nose, kind of halt them here, then we'll head up, we'll join Kirby Smith near Versailles. And that's where the true battle for Kentucky will happen. That was sort of what he thought. But again, not realizing that he was facing the bulk of Buell's army. But, his troops were much more battle hardened. I also wrote a book on George Maney's Confederate Brigade, which included 5 regiments. 4 of those had all seen combat before. One, the 41st Georgia, was a raw regiment. So that's kind of a good way I sort of look at it. It's like, out of a typical brigade that had 5 regiments, 1 or 2 on the Confederate side would have been green troops. The rest had at least seen some combat. Like the 1st Tennessee was in that brigade, which had fought, all over the place from the Cheat Mountain campaign in, West Virginia early on. Had fought at Shiloh, and a lot of these guys fought at Shiloh and other places, for example. And so they were a little more battle hardened, I think. And I think in a lot of ways, it's sort of a lot of the colonels on the Confederate side were pretty good too in terms of leading the troops as well on that kind of regimental level.
Well, that always goes for especially there's not too often you're going to get green troops that are able to take on troops that have been going at it for a while.
Right.
Time wise,
and kind of one thing, because is the Union left flank, which is on the northern end of the battlefield, got sort of shoved away. It turned out to be the 1st Wisconsin that was a veteran regiment that ended up sort of stopping the Confederate advance at that point. And technology really helped them out too, because a number of the men had bought Henry rifles, Henry repeating rifles, which is sort of like, for people who don't know, it's kind of like the Winchester rifle that you'd see in cowboy movies when we were kids, that lever action. And they bought them off the street, and so they put men with the Henry rifles on the flanks. And as these kind of worn out Confederate troops started attacking, the 1st Wisconsin just lit them up with these repeating rifles, and then did a countercharge and ended up sort of blunting the Confederate advance there. So, you did have these Union vets who, were finally able to kind of make a stand kind of late in the day as the battle was winding down. So, they're the ones who kind of helped turn the tide. And I think it shows the importance of having, some experienced regiments, especially who can hold, while everybody else is kind of melting away. And, that happened at battlefields all over the country, during that period.
Yeah. Now, I guess as far as time period though, so this one happened Perryville was it?
October of 1862 is when it was.
Okay.
So, politically during that time, which is interesting, you have Lincoln issues a preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, which of course angered Kentuckians who are, by majority pro-slavery. And so, the Confederates sort of thought, oh, we can come in here into the state as well and, talk about how, the federal armies are here to, take away enslaved people. And so there were kind of political motivations too, eventually, that, the Union or the Confederate Army had. I mean, you imagine if the Confederates had sort of won a big victory in Kentucky and, moved up to the Ohio River and crossed into Indiana, or if they'd shelled, Cincinnati, could that have influenced, congressional elections that were coming up that fall? Would peace Democrats have won if Cincinnati had gotten bombarded and, the Confederate armies were kind of knocking at the door of Southern Ohio? Would that have changed kind of the political focus of the war? So there are a lot of these what ifs that happened as a result of the Perryville campaign that I think are pretty compelling too. And, because you can't you can't separate the political consequences that are going on from the military activities that were happening as well. So that's, kind of an interesting angle. I had my own great-great-grandfather, for example, he was a surgeon in the 27th Kentucky that was at Perryville. He was a Union surgeon.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
And, and he was a Kentuckian. And, after the Emancipation Proclamation, he ended up resigning his commission. And a lot of Kentucky officers ended up doing that because, they were angry that what they perceived as being the war aims had changed. It was no longer a war to preserve the Union. It was a war to, end slavery. And these pro-slavery Kentuckians were pretty furious about it. And there are instances during the campaign of that. I think one interesting component about the Perryville campaign is that you have, Union troops from the Midwest are coming down to Kentucky and, are crossing the Ohio River for the first time. So the Perryville campaign is the first time they ever see slaves. And, a lot of them were shocked. Slaves who'd escaped ran into Union lines seeking protection. The number of kind of runaway slave ads in Louisville newspapers really sort of went up during that period. And, so the campaign had sort of deeper consequences too, because it showed these Union troops how horrific slavery was. And it sort of gave them, more motivation to win the war in a sense. And, that really kind of brought the ire of a lot of Unionist Kentuckians, like General Lovell Rousseau was a division commander and at Perryville. He was a Union division commander in the 21st Wisconsin. That Green Regiment that had been torn apart in the cornfield had been sort of sheltering escaped slaves, and Rousseau was furious about that and basically demanded that all the slaves be returned to their masters. And so you had a kind of almost a standoff between Rousseau and a bunch of Kentuckians and also this Wisconsin regiment. So, you start like pulling threads about the Perryville campaign and, you can explore everything from, the actual battle to what was going on politically in the armies at the time, to the, what was the impact of weather? What was the impact of, again, the terrain? And there's just so many different, again, threads you could pull that I find fascinating. And that's why I won't stop talking about it. So
that's all right. Well, Jets, a lot of people don't think about the political aspects, and not. I mean, obviously there's political aspects, but you think Civil War. Oh, this war is going on.
Right.
There's no elections going on, or there's nothing else going on. It's all about the war. But Abraham Lincoln runs for president during the Civil War. All these other states are having elections as well. I mean, in Kentucky, you even have the, Confederate state of Kentucky running elections and making counties and stuff that is all going on as well. These things kind of, people, they think, oh, war, that's the only thing that's happening. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on all at once.
Right. And, people, I think rightfully think, we're terribly divided politically now, which is unfortunate that we are so divided. But, it's nothing compared to how it was in, 1862, 1863, 1860. I mean, especially the presidential election of 1864. And you had, anti-war Democrats in the Midwest who were called Copperheads. They're sort of peace Democrats who wanted to end the war. And then towns in Indiana and Illinois, there were riots between, Unionists who wanted, Lincoln to win. And then also, Copperheads who were supporting George McClellan. I mean, people got killed in the streets after political, riots. And so it was, pretty dark time politically. And people, I think, tend to think, oh, it's northern Illinois or it's central Indiana. Nothing really happened in that area during the Civil War. Everything was fought, in the South. But the reality was, there was violence there too. It just happened to be sort of politically motivated. Not to the scale of a battle, of course, but still, it affected how people thought about the war, and it brought the war home in a very sort of visceral, terrible way. His family members were potentially killed. So,
Well, yeah.
Again, more threads.
Yeah. And you have Abraham Lincoln, president, Mary Todd, first lady. Her brothers are on the Confederate. It gets to the point that it's like,
right.
Everybody's in the fold here.
Yeah, and it's a quintessential Kentucky story, with Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln. And I actually wrote an ebook that you can buy on Kindle about Emily Todd Helm, who's Mary Todd Lincoln's half sister. And so she was married to Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin Hardin Helm, who'd been killed at the Battle of Chickamauga. And after he was killed, Emily really had nowhere to go, and she ended up, to make a long story short, going to the White House. Yeah, so you have this Confederate widow who was at the White House for a couple of months and, had a time arguing with, Union generals who were in the White House about who was winning the war and who was right. And, at one point after Emily had gotten in an argument with one general, it may have been Ben Butler. I'm drawing a blank on who it was, but, Lincoln sort of chuckled and says, that child has a sharp tongue like the rest of the Todds, which is kind of a great story. But, she ended up, it just, again, shows the divisions. They had Mary Todd Lincoln and Emily Todd Helm had two brothers who were killed during the war. And then later in the war, Emily ended up being sort of destitute in Kentucky. One of her brothers, Levi Todd, had died, and she had thought that basically Levi had asked the Lincolns for money. They didn't give it to Levi. He ended up sort of dying destitute. And Emily later wrote the Lincolns, to paraphrase, it was your bullets that made us, widows and orphans. And it was sort of created this terrible division between, Mary Todd Lincoln and her half sister, Emily Todd Helm, that lasted essentially for the rest of their lives, which is really sad. I'm actually a Todd descendant. So I'm interested in this. Like, Mary Todd Lincoln's grandfather is my fifth great grandfather. And I'm a Stuart descendant. So John Todd Stuart, who's Lincoln's first law partner, who's Mary Todd Lincoln's first cousin. I'm descended from his brother. So that's where the Stuart in my name comes from. And, so writing that sort of ebook was a lot of fun. So it was kind of, digging more into the family story a little bit as well. But, again, it's the typical Kentucky story of these families that were all divided. Brother against brother is not a cliche in Kentucky. And it happened in almost every family that was here. And
you think from the streets of Perryville to the White House. The Kentucky families were divided. Right. Completely. All over the place.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's there's a one of the Perryville casualties was eventually buried in Lexington, where he was from. He was fighting in a Tennessee regiment, and his remains were eventually moved to Lexington, and he's buried next to his brother, who's a Union soldier. So even in cemeteries around the state, you can find evidence of this sort of great divided family story that again sort of tore every community apart.
We're going to pause right here with our discussion with Stuart and the Battle of Perryville. Just a reminder, this coming weekend is the reenactment of the Battle of Perryville, a great Civil War event right here in Kentucky, which I highly recommend you go and visit. Once again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.